Hi, welcome to this lecture on first prop speeches. I'm gonna first introduce myself. Hi, my name is Raya. I'm from Slovenia. I was a Slovenian debater for about 5 years. Now I live and study in the Netherlands. I study psychology and neuroscience, and I love it here. I also teach debate here. So today we're going to talk about first prop speeches, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to go through different types of motions, and we're going to talk about how you as a first prop speaker can adapt to all different types of situations. My goal is to really give you a diverse toolkit to use in different kinds of prep times. We're going to focus on impromptu prep especially, and we're going to talk about even emotions where you have no idea what to do, emotions where you maybe know a lot of things, but you don't know how to organize. I'm going to try to prepare you for different kinds of scenarios. So hopefully this will be very practically helpful. Okay, so brief outline, we're going to talk about what to do in prep time. We're going to analyze different types of motions. I know this is not a lecture on types of motions, but I think it goes hand in hand, and I think it's absolutely necessary to know how to respond based on what the motion needs of you. We're going to talk about how to make great arguments, how to impact them, and lastly, we're going to do a short exercise. Okay, we can just go ahead and get started. Okay, before we start talking about the actual speech, we need to talk about prep time. Now, the thing about prep time is you can really do it the way it suits you as an individual, you as a debater. There is no absolute rule on how to do it, but there are some tips that I really recommend. I was the first speaker for a few years. I was the first speaker on the national team as well. And also now I coach loads of kids, and I noticed that certain things just work better than others in the majority of cases. First of all, I think note taking is crucial. Once again, you should have your own style of note taking that suits you. But something which is incredibly useful, an advice that was given to me when I just got into the national team, was that as soon as you start brainstorming in impromptu time, you should divide a list of paper, a piece of paper onto three categories. And then every single idea that anyone gives, you should put into one of those three categories. I suggest you do that as the first speaker because you are kind of in charge of the majority of substantive content in the debate. Of course, you can also delegate this to someone else, but I think this really helps with a structure from the very beginning, and it also helps to organize the thoughts of the whole team. This is just an assumption, but oftentimes the first speaker is also either team leader or someone who's in charge of prep time, just because first speakers tend to have better organization than other speakers. So I assume you will also be doing this. Regardless of that, I think you should really start organizing all of the content in impromptu time from the beginning already. Another thing is, as a first prep speaker, when you are making your notes, make sure to write down the model in detail. Everything else, you can leave some blank spaces. Everything else, you can use just keywords. But when it comes to the model, if the debate requires a model, make sure to really list it down with every single bullet point, every single detail, because later on, if the debate gets messy, you will desperately need that piece of paper with your model clearly lined out to show it to the other team. What are other things apart from note taking? Well, first of all, I really encourage you as a first speaker to continuously start a discussion on framing. What I mean by that is sometimes in impromptu, you talk about framing and the characterizations in the beginning for a few minutes, but then you kind of forget about it. I suggest you keep bringing this up, and even when you're making arguments, go back to framing and say, hey, is it then maybe important that we include this criteria in framing or this characterization? So make sure to keep that relevant throughout prep time and to update your framing along your prep time. Agree with your teammates on what key examples should be for the debate. Think of 1, 2, 3 examples that you should all be using, or just all have, all keep in mind so you are on the same page when it comes to your case. In the last 5 minutes, I suggest you ask your team members to listen to you and to listen what your case is, because most likely they will send you away to write your arguments for 15 minutes or however long you want to. And they won't know what the last version of the arguments was. So make sure to dedicate a few minutes of everyone's time at the end of prep time to briefing about the arguments and what they're about. And lastly, this is just something for you individually as a first prep speaker. Last 2 minutes of prep time. Are you able to list your impacts? If you're not able to list 3, 4 impacts, that means maybe you don't have them sufficiently developed. So make sure they're simple, concise, and that they're there. Because if you realize that you cannot list your simple impact, that means maybe your argument's not impacted enough. So make sure to keep that in mind. So take a picture of this, bring it to your prep time. I think these are just a few like useful things that really, really strongly improve the quality of prep time. Okay, this is just another very helpful thing that I've noticed helps. So this is the first speaker checklist. This is something that you should include. I color coded it here on the right. Again, you can take a picture of this. We don't have to go through everything. But so it's optional to have a catchy theme line, but I think it's great to start a speech like that. Maybe especially if you're in your first or second year of world schools, or if you're just beginning with this format, I think this is a great way to structure your first prop speech. And also first op speech, by the way. A lot of it is just overlap. This is called first prop because first prop has a more set outline, but you can also do all of those things on op, especially framing, characterizations, that's all useful for both sides. So yeah, have a catchy theme line. What I mean by that is just stylistically strong introduction, have a problem statement, really make sure to define why are we even having this debate. So it doesn't look like your arguments are just floating around with no clear problem. Have definitions if necessary. Some motions are so simple you don't need them, but in the vast majority of cases, you will need definitions. Specify actors for motion. So what I mean by that is if the motion says this house believes that organizations should support this action, make sure to specify what the organizations are. Very, very important. As a first prop speaker, you should definitely have characterizations. 100% all debates, all types of motions, you always need to characterize or put some sort of narratives in there. Have a model if necessary according to the motion. And lastly, have some sort of burdens or criteria to win. I know that the American debate circuit uses more burden of proof. I know that some other circuits just use criteria to win. Whatever you use, make sure to have a few sentences of what your side and the other side needs to prove in order to win this debate. After your arguments, you should also have a takeaway of your speech. I think this is just stylistically beneficial. So you say, dear judge, this is the takeaway of my speech. And you really give just 1 or 2 points, just very, very brief summation. So they know like what the whole point was about. So it doesn't look as messy as it might have before. Okay, so now we're going to move into types of motions and how to respond to them. First one, very obvious, this house would debate. In my slides, you will always see an example of a motion at the top. We're not going to do this motion specifically, but these are always just examples. So in a this house would motion, almost always you will need a model that is specific to this type of a motion. Once you're making a model, you have to make it specific. By specific, I don't always mean to have all the statistics, to have all the numbers, because that's just not realistic in prep time. By specific, I mean, ask yourself, what would this realistically look like in real world? And also, what can the other side attack us on? Will they say we didn't explain this well enough? Is this part unclear? So always make sure to answer questions like who, when, what, how, all of those basic questions that make your model comprehensive. Something that's just a pro tip is oftentimes when you're making a model, it's often useful to just say a board of experts would do that or would decide based on that. For example, we should tax all cars because of environmental damage. The other side would say, hey, but how do we know who to tax? Who to tax and how much to tax them? You can just say we would have a board of experts of environmental experts that would be in charge of determining proportionate taxes. So that's a good way to kind of circumvent any sort of a tax. Lastly, in terms of the model, you should make sure you also talk about what are the exceptions to the model and specify them. And also let's talk about what are punishments if you're debating a certain policy, and if that policy is breached, what would happen to those who breach the policy. Another thing to talk about in this House would motions is fiat power. Fiat power means, will my policy work and why? So oftentimes your models might be a bit too demanding or too difficult to pass through as policies in real life. If you would come up here and say, we as a proposition would make everybody vegetarian according to law. That's something that probably would not pass in real life. So make policies which are realistic. And if you have a policy which is a bit of a larger idea, which is not so definitely to pass in real life as a policy, make sure to justify why it's likely that there will be enough political capital or there will be enough social support for this policy to pass. On the right, I wrote a question: should I do a counter prop? This is for opposition, but I'm sure it's useful because you will be that on that side half of the time. Should you do counter prop if you're in a debate where you think that's the best option? I would advise against doing counter props because in the vast majority of cases they backfire because you under explain them. If you're in such a debate where you think that is the only way to win, make sure to explain it even better than you would a model on side of proposition, because then the burden to prove an alternative policy is truly just on your side, and you kind of shift all the focus to your model. So if you do a counter prop, make sure to overly explain it in detail, and justify it why it's likely, why it's even possible. But I would, in majority of cases, advise against doing counter prop. Okay, next we have this house believes that motions. So this is, I think, probably the second most common type. Here we have like just an example. This house believes that the Pope should be elected by Catholics around the world. So as you can see, there usually isn't a policy involved, but just supporting a certain idea and debating pros and cons of that idea. So what are key points of these types of motions? First of all, you are debating whether something does more harm than good, so pros and cons. That means you cannot just win by listing pros alone or cons alone. You always need to be comparative. If you are not comparative, you will probably lose. Debate is all about being comparative. And especially in these types of motions, it's not enough to just give positive or negative arguments. The second point is whether something is justified. So here, make sure to include a metric. When is something justified? So for example, when it helps the majority of people, when it works in the majority of cases. Usually we'll just have to show that, in more than half the cases or something, this policy or this idea is a good thing. But make sure to explicitly mention that in your framing. And last thing is something should be done. So you need to also show the necessity. This is kind of similar to this house would, but you do not have to include a model in it. This house believes that motion. It's more about why is it likely to look like that. So why the scenario which will take place after this motion is likely to occur based on the world we live in now and based on history, based on past events. So make sure to show me why the trend of today shows that that will be a likely tomorrow. Okay, the next type of motion is a this house supports motion. So for example, this house supports the rise of far left politics in Western countries. This is actually very, very similar to this house believes that motion. But in a way, it is even more specific. It's more specific in the sense that you are really debating a trend. What I mean by trend is you're looking at the status quo, or you're looking at the world and you're noticing certain changes happening, certain trends, and you're just looking whether you would support that continuing or not. So make sure in your framing to define concretely what are you talking about, what kind of trend in real life are you talking about. So for example, this motion that's written above about the far left, make sure to really talk about what is this trend of the far left rising, where do we see it, how does it look like? You need to be able to describe whether this trend is rising or declining and characterize it. You need to support it exactly the way it happened. You cannot kind of say, yes, the way it happened, but with a few alterations. This is really not possible in these types of debates. You can also not really offer alternative policies to make this trend better. In most debates, that will just make you sound unrealistic and make you sound like you're trying to avoid the debate happening. So make sure to really debate realistically in these types of rounds. Oftentimes, being a bit more critical towards your side and debating more realistic will bring you further in debates than avoiding the debate happen in the middle ground. So oftentimes you should concede a little bit and not be perfectionist. Not making your side seem as too perfect. A very common argument that you can use here is that a bad thing is better when it is common. So we can talk about basically any trend that occurs. If you support it, it will likely become more popularized, normalized, and likely there will be more regulation once it is normalized. Just something to keep in mind because it's a useful argument. So I think it would be beneficial here to look into the example of the motion we had before and just how to characterize it to win debates. Because oftentimes coaches and judges say, you did not characterize this enough, or your narrative was just underexplained, the other side had a much clearer narrative. I know this can sound abstract, and also in this presentation, I do understand that some things may just sound too abstract and not practical enough to use. So I just want to go over an example. Maybe this will be obvious to you, but I'm sure it will help someone, especially if you hear that a lot from judges and you don't know what to do about it. So the motion we're talking about is this House supports the rise of far-left politics in Western countries. And we're gonna talk about how to characterize everything in emotion. I always suggest to over-characterize terms in emotion than under-characterize them, meaning if you think that something is a little bit ambiguous or has several interpretations, talk about it, describe it, characterize it. So how would you characterize far-left politics? A small reminder that your characterizations should be accurate and mostly objective, but you can be selective about them in terms of you can choose what things to say to benefit your side. You can be selective about the facts you choose, but the facts have to be accurate. So how would you characterize far left politics? You could say, these are all just examples, by the way. I'm not saying that any of these characterizations are absolutely correct or useful in all types of debates, but this is just an example. So far left politics are usually further left than the Democratic Party in the United States. They include a lot of young people, Gen Z, millennials, just a lot of young people who grow up with us. They use mostly social media to gain support. They use Instagram, they use Facebook, they use Twitter in order to gain more followers because that's the main media today. And far left politics can be also seen as a response to deteriorating quality of life for young people. So it's something for them to resort to because they feel left out, they feel disappointed because the establishment has kind of abandoned them. So I think this characterization is beneficial for your side because you are portraying far left in a very positive light. Positive light. You are being accurate as well, but of course you're not talking about all aspects of it, and you are leaving out a few negative examples. Okay, so how would you characterize rise? So this is a word which may seem very obvious, but I think here again you are describing the trend which we see in status quo. So what I mean by that is a rise can look like several things, and a rise can be negative, it can be positive, it can be something random. So in this example, you could say we see the rise of left-wing politics by politicians who support this kind of politics getting more and more voters, getting more supporters, a bigger voter baseline, just more also funds. We can also see a normalization of calling yourself far left. So it is much more normal today to call yourself Marxist than it might have been 30 years ago. And lastly, it is also more normal for popular media to take a hard left stance. For example, the youth cosmopolitan magazine, I think it's called Teen, whatever, has published a few Marxist articles like calling them Marxists. This is also something which wasn't possible 30 years ago. So just a few very random examples of how you describe a trend, in this case, a rise. Okay, so after this, you can take a short break. Feel free to pause and come back whenever you want to. Okay, the next type of motion that I like to talk about is a this house regrets motion. And this is also about trends. So it's almost the same as this house supports, but the opposite. A key difference, which is small, but in some debates it's very significant, is that you are debating about the past. You're not debating about the future, which is clear from the motion because it's this House regrets. But I cannot tell you the number of times I've seen this House regrets motions to just happen in the future or happen as if we were debating this House believes that motion. So make sure to really be reflective on the past. Here we're looking in retrospective. Um, in this types of motions, the one thing that you absolutely need to do is the counterfactual, or sometimes we call it the alternative world. What I mean by that is if you are regretting something which has happened in the past, without that happening, what would the alternative world likely look like? So an example that I've given here is this House regrets the rise of China. And it's obvious to find arguments about why the rise of China is good or bad. But as the other side, you absolutely need to also, not as just as the other side, actually, as both sides, you need to talk about what would be the likely scenario if China wouldn't be this powerhouse it is today. What other powerhouse would rise? What would the economy look like? Who would take such a large space in the market? What would happen to the United States? Those are all questions that you should ask yourself in prep time. And this is something you should do for all motions which are this House regrets. So make sure to talk about counterfactual and make sure to also justify it. Why is it just feasible for that scenario to be the alternative scenario? Okay, the next motion we're talking about is actor motion, or this House as X would do something. Very, very often you will be defending a certain country. So this House as United States, this House as China. Very often you will also be defending certain social movement, such as the LGBT community, such as the feminist movement, the environmentalist movement. And very rarely you will also be defending an individual person. So this House as Britney Spears, this House as Joe Biden would do this and this. Another niche that sometimes appears, but not very often, is also this House as a Democrat voter or this House as a Western liberal person. Those are just a few ideas to know what the actor might be that you will be defending. So what is significant about these types of motions, and what as a first speaker you have to absolutely define in the beginning of your speech in the framing, is you're talking about what is the interest of the actor that you are defending. So you're not just talking about, in the example of the motion above, whether military intervention is a good thing or not. You're talking about whether you as the US government, as the US president, have the interest to do that, and whether the outcomes of that action will benefit you directly. So you need to define what the incentives are and how you are reaching those incentives. You absolutely need to debate from their perspective. And this is a one type of debate where it's okay to be selfish and really just look at the benefits for you as that actor. And you can really neglect other things. It's not your burden essentially to prove that this action will benefit the majority of society, the majority of other people. You can really just look into your incentives and the outcomes for you. However, it is an added benefit if you can also prove that this action will be beneficial for the majority of society. But once again, it is not really your burden to do that. Something that I practically advise you to do is at the end of your arguments, make sure to dedicate about 30 seconds to specify why this argument is in the interest of that actor. So if you have an argument about why military intervention is bad because there's a lot of destruction, because there is a lot of casualties and financial loss, you need to specify at the end why specifically for the United States this is such a negative thing. So you can talk about the US soldiers dying, you can talk about the public perception of war, you can talk about how that impacts the voting behavior, whatever it is, make it specific to the actor. Because I think in most cases, it is obvious to us that you are debating for that actor, but so often teams just lose because they thought they were defending the actor, but they weren't specific enough in their arguments. That's why I'm really emphasizing this. And I encourage you to really keep that in mind as the number one priority when you're debating these types of motions. All right, so now we're done with types of motions. We ran out of them. So we're going to talk about arguments. Now, this is not a lecture about argumentation, so we will not go in depth. I will just give you a few tips and tricks to improve your arguments, but I think argumentation is the basic tenet of debating, and it's not something you can learn from one lecture, and it's not something you learn in a year even. It takes a long time to become really good at building arguments. But these are a few things you can include to very quickly improve your argumentation. It says that this is advanced argumentation because we're not going to look into the structure of arguments, the thesis, the analysis, the impacts. We're going to look at slightly more advanced things that speakers include to win debates. So the motion that we will be talking about is this House regrets the glorification of soldiers as heroes. I think that's a very popular motion. And we're going to look into one argument specifically just to narrow it down and make everything very practical and very clear and as, you know, not very vague and not very abstract for you. So the argument we're looking into is countries are more likely to go to war because they think what soldiers are doing is absolutely good because they see soldiers as heroes. So essentially more war because we think that what's going on there is all good. So first thing that you should include is the context slash narrative. Now you should know that context and narrative are something that should be included in the framing already. It's not something you should start talking about in the argument, but you should have several contexts in your speech. One is not enough. So probably you will have some context in narrative in your framing about what the status quo look like, what you're proposing, but then also in your arguments, make it a bit more specific. So in this context, we're talking about what does it look like when somebody is seen as a hero? So they're probably being glorified by the people. There are movies about them. There are songs about them. People respect you more if you say you are a war veteran. Those are just a few examples of the narrative of seeing someone as a hero. The next thing is you need to describe what changes or what the mechanisms are. I think this is the one part which debaters always think they do, but in a majority of cases, the judges will say you did not do that, and you probably don't do that very well, because oftentimes debaters don't want to say things which are blatantly obvious, like what changes with this motion, right? That's the first thought you have when you are doing impromptu prep time. But it's so obvious that you probably don't say it, and in the end, that would be the missing link in your analysis because judges cannot put their own knowledge into the debate and they cannot imagine the analysis that wasn't there, even if that analysis was absolutely obvious. So, for example, what does this narrative do? Does this narrative mean that soldiers can just get away with things, that they have absolute legitimacy to do whatever they want? Does that mean that they have unlimited support by the government and also unlimited funding? Does that mean that when they commit war crimes or sexual assault in the military, they will get lower punishment or they will just get excused? Just as a few examples. So those are the mechanisms, the ways in which narrative works in real life. Mechanisms are about changing incentives. So basically, what is different for this group of people? The very last thing you should do when you're making arguments is you should talk about why that is so important or impacts. Impacts, I think, are very easy to make, but sometimes we just miss them because that's, again, the next logical step and we just miss out on it. So you should make your impacts very concrete and very short and catchy. Usually the impact will be something like affects a lot of people, helps people's mental health, saves lives. They're very obvious. And if you had sufficient analysis to support it, your impacts can be very short because it will be clear to the judge why this happens. They just need to tick the box and say, yes, they did tell me that people's lives will be saved. I believe that happens. So make sure to make them concise and clear. So just an example of a impact here would be because we have more conflicts, that means that there will be more death on both sides of the conflict. So here the impact is clear, it's concise, it has been proven before by the analysis, and there's no need to lose more time on it. Okay, I already talked about impacting in the previous slide, but here we're going to go a little bit more in depth in more complicated debates. So in some debates, impacting is straightforward. It is literally as simple as lives are saved, people's mental health is better, um, feminists are better off. But in some debates, you need to be a little more detailed, especially when the other side is bringing good impacts as well. So you need to make your impacts comparative. And let's just go into more explanation of what should your impacts contain in order to make them better than the other side. So first of all, you should say why we as people care about this argument. So that would be the part I was mentioning earlier about people's lives are saved. So that is why we care about it, which is very intuitive. This is the intuitive part. The second part is why should the judge care about this argument? This is the part which is not about anything about making it sound stylistically nice or intuitive. This is the part where you explain to the judge why this argument in this specific round is relevant. So you say, other side neglected this group of people, we talk about them, therefore you should care about this argument. Or you can say, the other side never proved that this is true for the majority of cases. Our argument is true for the majority of cases, therefore, the impacts are better. So essentially, you're showing what the other side hasn't done that you have done with this argument in the debate. Why what you are proving has not been proven by the other side. What are some strategies of impacting? Essentially, how can you phrase your impact to make it sound unique and make it sound like it's better than the other side? So first of all, you can say that your impacts are mutually exclusive or unique. That's essentially the same side. Basically, you have essentially the same thing. What I'm trying to say is you make your impact sound like they only exist in your side, while the other side cannot and has not proven them. The second thing is you show that your impacts are irreversible. What that means is you show this happens and it cannot go back, and therefore this is such a good impact. For example, laws are reversible, so a law would not be a great impact. But when you're debating, for example, death penalty, you can say, if you are defending it, this is irreversible. It is a good idea because that way we can be sure that it has worked. Or on the other side, you can say exactly because it is irreversible, it is a bad idea. We cannot excuse someone who has been falsely accused. So you can play around with whether something is reversible or not, but it is one lens through which you can look into your impact and show why it is important or not. The next one is very obvious. Number of people, if you show that your impacts are true for the majority of people, for a lot of people, that usually just makes them strong. It is especially helpful if you have numbers or if you describe in a way in which that group of people is affected, because, number of people just saying helps everyone is kind of played out, and it's not something that's very impactful anymore for the judges. They hear it in every round without being supported enough. So try to be a bit more specific than just it helps the majority of people, but tell us in which ways does it help those people. And the very last one is just vulnerable groups. So that's saying even if it doesn't help the majority of people, it helps the group of people which is vulnerable. For example, it helps the immigrants, it helps the LGBT community, it helps children. You make it a bit more emotional, but also realistic. You help a group of people which is already at a disadvantage, but make sure to always describe why that group is vulnerable and why they deserve the help that they get. Okay, so we are at the end of this lecture. The last thing I'll do is just describe what the drill is for this lecture. So the drill is maybe a little bit different than just individual practice. And that's because being a first prop speaker is never individual work, or at least it shouldn't be individual work. If your fellow teammates make you work alone, that's not good. So it should be teamwork anyway. So what I've created is a Google Doc file where you have two motions, which are written there above. They're also in documents, so you don't have to take a picture or anything. So you have to go into the document, and that document contains two proposition cases, one for each of the motion. And what you have to do is take about 5 to 10 minutes to just write any part of those cases that you want. You can either focus on the framing, the problem, examples, argumentation, impacts, whichever aspect you prefer. You can also choose to work on one or both of the motion. It really doesn't matter. I think it's really up to you. Just have the integrity and work on the part of the document which you feel like you want to work on. So something you want to improve on. After a while, I will also start leaving feedback comments on the side, but I suggest you choose a part of the case which you think you are the weakest in to really try to improve that part. Um, and also, it's not absolutely necessary you work on it as you are watching this lecture or afterwards. You can work on it a few days later because there's no time limit on this. It's just work in progress that I will be checking every now and then. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this drill. Okay, thank you very much for coming to this lecture. I included a quote that I made up, which is, the next time a third speaker underestimates you, ask them to do a first prop speech. And that's just a little joke because first prop speakers are so often underrated, but the work they do is unique in terms of you need to have organizational skills, you need to have a very clear structure, you need to keep in mind of what has to be said and that everything is perfect from the beginning of the debate. And it's certainly a unique skill set which benefits all types of workers. Even if you watch this lecture and you're a second or a third speaker, I definitely suggest you go and do the role of the first prop speaker for a couple of debates. It really gives you that extra skill which you don't attain in any other speaker position. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time and effort. And I hope you're enjoying this academy overall.